The device you are using to watch this video made over 100 border crossings before it reached your hands. Raw materials were extracted in Central Asia so that individual components could be manufactured in Taiwan, which used machinery from Central Europe to meet design specifications that were drafted in South Korea, China, or the US, to reach final assembly in East Asia and made compatible to run on operating systems designed in the US. Components used in a single iPhone rely on over 200 individual suppliers. To say that your device had to make over 100 border crossings before being unboxed is probably an understatement. This complex web of commerce is achieved through the process of globalization. Safe shipping lanes and a global commitment to international trade make this all possible. Globalization has increased the quality of life for more people than any other economic system in human history. People around the world have access to more goods at lower prices than ever before. Best of all, globalization lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty. No other economic policy has done more for the extreme poor than globalization. And it's all coming to an end soon. This video is largely sourced from the book The End is Just the Beginning by Peter Zion. It is linked in the description. Global trade is nothing new. Anyone who even knows just a little bit about history has heard of the Silk Road or the Triangular Trade. However, these early globalization trade networks lacked safe and secure passages. Piracy and kleptocracy made foreign trade incredibly expensive and risky. Global trade was isolated within specific European empires. The English, French, Spanish, and others all had their own trade networks and rarely traded with one another. Of course, they would steal from each other during times of war, which happened often. The lack of cooperation between European powers made it easier for pirates to roam the Caribbean and Mediterranean seas. If ships could evade pirates, their cargo may still be plundered by rival nations. It was quite common for competing European powers to steal each other's cargo. The English would steal from the French would steal from the Spanish, and pirates would steal from everybody. Clashing colonial powers would make foreign trade unreliable, and in turn more expensive. This would be the norm of global trade until 1945. By the end of the Second World War, there would only be 2 global powers, each with their own sphere of influence. But unlike the USSR, the United States would emerge as the world's sole naval power. While the Soviets would hold Eastern Europe and Central Asia, America would have the oceans. All of them. When Western Europe had their turn with controlling the global oceans, that power was used exclusively to enrich the mother country. A mix of colonization and state-sponsored monopolies were all designed to generate wealth for the homeland. When Americans took control of the seas, they had a different idea. Scarred by the horrors of the world wars, the United States decided to use their naval superiority to grant free trade across all nations, including their very recent enemies. Everyone could participate in this new, free, global trade network. The high cost of providing a global navy to keep shipping lanes safe would be paid entirely by the Americans. There was only one catch to participate in this free global trade network. You would have to be firmly anti-Soviet. Despite this geopolitical mandate, a new era of global trade was unleashed. The days of cargo ships being stolen by rival nations or pirates was over. If your country lacked natural resources or food, it could now be easily imported, without needing to bow to a European colonial master. And this was just the beginning. The free trade network would eventually be opened up to communist China in 1979. The golden age of globalism had arrived. In this new era, Brits could play Nintendo, Americans could drive Volkswagen, and Indians could drink Coca-Cola. But the golden age of economic growth wasn't solely due to the American Navy providing safe passage around the world. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund were established to provide loans to nations that missed out on industrialization. Underdeveloped nations could get low-interest loans to rapidly industrialize. Of course, these loans came with political strings attached, notably anti-corruption and anti-Soviet agreements. Nonetheless, these loans, in conjunction with free global trade, ushered in an age of prosperity. for both the developed and underdeveloped world. Wealthy countries could offshore manufacturing to nations with cheaper labor costs and fewer regulations. The underdeveloped nations would be flooded with new job opportunities, and wealthy countries could get more goods at lower prices. Nearly everyone outside the Soviet sphere saw their quality of life improve. This era saw the fastest global economic growth in human history, at least until the next era of globalization.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the late 1980s, the Soviet Empire began to crumble. Eastern Europe and Central Asia were now allowed to join the globalized economy, while the transition from a command economy into a free market economy made for a rough decade in the 90s. They would be winners in the long run. With a reunited Germany and a strong belief that international trade results in international peace, EU investments flowed towards the East. The former Warsaw Pact countries saw an explosion of growth, and even had higher growth rates than their Western neighbors. Manufactured exports was the name of the game for these countries, and their wealth would rise. But the end of the Cold War wasn't the only thing that enhanced global trade. There was this cool new technology called the Internet.
What is Internet anyway?
Internet is that massive computer network, the one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what Internet is?
The Internet made transcontinental communication cheaper than ever before. The cost of transforming a national corporation into an international one was radically cheaper. But big corporations were not the only beneficiaries of the Internet. Now, small artisans could access the global market to find new customers, new suppliers, and new investors. A Tuareg guitarist could attract audiences in the Netherlands. Dominican painters could find customers in Australia. And Mexican artists could make custom pieces for clients in China. The world was smaller, faster, cheaper, and everyone was getting richer. Well, almost everyone. If the effects of globalization could be summarized in one page, this is the graph to look at. Officially known as the Lachner-Milanovic graph, it is better known as the elephant graph, due to its unique shape. This graph shows the international wealth growth experienced between the fall of the Berlin Wall to the Great Recession. The left end shows the poorest of the poor, and the right end the richest of the rich. The furthest left end represents people in countries who weren't able to fully capitalize on globalization. They live in areas that are too remote or too unstable to have tapped into the wealth creation caused by globalization. Moving to the right, we see tremendous growth. These are the developing nations that became the real winners of globalization. India, China, Mexico, and Brazil are all well known for their growth during this period. But this growth wasn't limited to large countries. Smaller countries like the Dominican Republic, Lithuania, Panama, Angola, and dozens more also experienced impressive GDP per capita growth. Wealth generation from globalization was available to all, big and small. This exceptional growth rate brought about 1.1 billion people out of extreme poverty. Because of globalization, starvation and famines have become exceptionally rare. People no longer have to depend on local weather for good harvests. Fertilizers, high-tech agricultural equipment, and the latest advances in irrigation technology can now be easily imported. The amount of tonnage yields per acre skyrocketed for almost every crop in every continent. Does your country have poor soils for agricultural production? No problem. Imported food is cheap and plentiful. There is no need to toil on poor land when your country could specialize in something else. Because of global agricultural trade, every country in the world, with 5 tragic exceptions, saw a decrease in deaths caused by malnutrition. This all sounds like a pretty good deal, until we start to move further right along the elephant graph. The wealth growth takes a considerable nosedive. These are the low-skilled and semi-skilled workers in rich countries. The working class of the Anglosphere and Western Europe would not enjoy the same wealth growth as the rest of the world. And in some cases, quite the opposite. These people saw their careers shipped overseas, to people who would do the same job for cheaper. Entire communities in the United States were left devastated by the results of globalization, creating a massive region known as the Rust Belt. The factories that were once so critical in winning the Second World War became shuttered in favor of cheaper labor in faraway places. Once thriving middle-class communities became ghettoized. This isn't unique to the United States. Communities throughout the Anglosphere and Western Europe have their own version of the Rust Belt. Places like Southern Ontario, Wollongong, Wales, Flanders, the Ruhrgebiet, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, and the Basque Country have all felt economic hardship from globalization. Economic insecurity made the working class of rich countries hostile towards globalization. Their animosity is further compounded as we continue to move right along the elephant graph. On the furthest right end, we see the richest people in the richest countries getting richer. This is the class of people who have been able to truly tap into the wealth creation created by globalization. This part of the graph can be divided into two sections: highly skilled workers and the investor class. The growth of globalization meant that brands now have to compete with companies on the other side of the planet. To remain competitive in the global marketplace, they need highly skilled workers. The demand for engineers, researchers, marketers, designers, and other highly skilled workers greatly increased. As demand for these highly skilled workers increased, so did their salaries. On the very far right end of the graph is the investor class. When the world is undergoing unprecedented economic growth, it's pretty easy to turn a large pile of money into an even bigger pile of money. This led to resentment from the working class people in rich countries. To the people on the lower trunk of the elephant, it seems like everyone in the world is getting richer, except for themselves. While they lived in fear of unemployment, their fellow countrymen were enjoying exceptional wealth growth. For most of the G7 nations, a strong welfare system has been put in place. Even if someone loses their job due to globalization, they can still plan on receiving healthcare, their kids can still go to university at reasonable costs, and they themselves can receive new training to pursue a higher paying career. This is all paid by taxing the gains of the winners of globalization to fund programs for the losers of globalization. Every G7 country does this to a certain extent, except for one, which just so happens to be the one that pays for the global navy that makes this all possible in the first place. Most US citizens do not have a favorable opinion of globalization. When asked if globalization is a good thing for their country, only 42% of Americans answered in the affirmative. And that's not too far off from the global country average, where only 48% of respondents think globalization is good for their country. While it would be easy to say, who cares what the stupid Americans think? It should not be forgotten that the American Navy makes globalization possible in the first place. Without it, the bad old days of piracy and theft from rival governments will make a comeback. The increased risk of stolen cargo translates into increased costs for consumers. While international trade can certainly exist on land within connected regions, shipping by sea has about 1/12 of the cost compared to land shipping, assuming their safe passage on the seas. When the Soviet Empire fell, the purpose of the global American Navy fell with it. America's global naval presence had one main objective: keep the Soviets contained. Global trade security was just a side benefit. With the Soviets gone, the global US Navy lost its purpose. The American public's frustration with globalization would become apparent during the 2016 presidential election. Near the end of his presidency, George W. Bush began the lengthy negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. These negotiations would be continued by Barack Obama and last his entire presidency. This would have been a massive trade deal that included 12 Pacific countries. Combined, these 12 countries represent about 40% of global GDP. However, the deal would face major opposition from two prominent presidential candidates.
Nobody doubts that corporations have shut down in America and gone to low-wage countries. It makes sense to them. Why do they want to pay an American worker 15 or 20 bucks an hour when you go to Vietnam? You know what the minimum wage in Vietnam is? It is 56 cents an hour.
As Bernie Sanders said, Hillary Clinton voted for virtually every trade agreement that has cost the workers of this country millions of jobs. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the greatest danger yet. The TPP, as it's known, would be the death blow for American manufacturing.
While Bernie would not make it to the White House, Trump did. The United States would formally withdraw from the TPP on Trump's first day of office. But scuttling the TPP wasn't Trump's only anti-globalization initiative. He would live up to his campaign promise on reducing trade with China by introducing new tariffs in 2018. Even with Trump out of the White House, his tariffs remain. President Biden has stated that he's open to reconfiguring these tariffs, but no action has been taken at the time of this video. The American public has a growing skepticism of globalization, and it's starting to impact elections. American taxpayers pay over $150 billion every year to keep the oceans safe for free trade, and voters are questioning if it's worth it. Globalization has been the best thing to happen to high-skilled workers in poor countries, but the worst thing to happen to low-skilled workers in rich countries. The frustration has led to an increased sense of nationalism and isolationism, not only in America, but in many parts of the highly developed world. And that was before the 2020s.
Scientists in China are trying to determine if a new virus strain is responsible for a pneumonia outbreak in the city of Wuhan.
Globalization may have been able to survive populism, but it probably won't be able to survive the 2020s. COVID taught the world a lot of lessons, including what happens when global supply chains are weakened. The world experienced shortages of just about everything: toilet paper, lumber, new cars, any device with a microchip, all had their turn in being in short supply, some of which have yet to fully recover. To see how fragile the global economy actually is, let's take a look at America's greatest gift to the world: blue jeans. Blue jeans are obviously a low-tech product, and one would assume it has a simple supply chain. This would be an incorrect assumption. The cotton produced to make blue jeans probably would have been grown in China, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, or Benin. The raw cotton would then need to be processed into yarn, probably in India, China, the United States, Uzbekistan, or Brazil. The yarn would then need to be dyed, likely in Spain, Turkey, or Tunisia. Of course, this dyeing process would rely on chemicals manufactured in Germany. The finished denim would then be transported to China, Mexico, or Bangladesh to make its final ascent into blue jeans. Do you like your blue jeans with rivets? Then we'll need even more supply chain steps. The ore to make those rivets need to be mined in Brazil, Peru, Namibia, Australia, or Chile. The ore needs to be shipped to rivet factories in Germany, Turkey, or Mexico. And do you like your jeans with zippers? That's a whole nother supply chain that we'll skip for now. The average pair of jeans made 10 border crossings before reaching the hands of the final consumer. And that doesn't account for rivets, zippers, buttons, or other add-ons. And all this just for a stinking pair of pants. Electronics get way more complicated. But you get the idea. Despite globalization's complexity, everything worked, until it didn't. By January 2022, pretty much every country decided that we would have to live with COVID. Reliable vaccines were available for everyone, and we decided to start to move back to normal. As German Health Minister Jens Spahn said, pretty much everyone in Germany will be vaccinated, recovered, or dead. Despite the macabre statement, this sentiment was largely agreed with across the world. After 2 years of quarantines, the world was ready to get back to normal, regardless of vaccination rates. There is one exception to this sentiment, and they just so happen to be the second biggest player in globalization: China. At the time of this video, the official stance from Beijing is that they will maintain a zero-COVID policy until at least 2027. Zero COVID entails isolating entire buildings, neighborhoods, districts, or even cities to keep COVID contained. Reliable numbers of how many people are enduring lockdowns are hard to come by, but its economic impact has been felt very hard via inflation. While the rest of the world is ready to get back to working and consuming, China is not, and everything is more expensive because of it. Remember the earlier blue jean example? China appeared more times than any other nation in the supply chain, and China is involved in way more than just blue jeans. They're involved in everything. The more value added a good has, the more dependency it has on China. With China's zero COVID policy, inventories are low and prices are high. Companies who are heavily reliant on Chinese manufacturing are scrambling to find alternatives. China and the US have been growing distant for the past 6 years or so, but that's being kicked into overdrive due to the zero COVID policy. If your biggest trading partner isn't making anything to trade, there aren't many options to consider other than trying to find a new manufacturing partner. This dilemma isn't unique to the United States. Nearly every European and Latino publication that I've come across in researching this is also expressing frustration with China's zero COVID stance. This is forcing multinational companies to find new manufacturing partners outside of China. Rebuilding factories in new locations will be costly and timely, but not as hard as finding a way to replace China's gigantic workforce. But the good news for China is that they won't be remembered as the biggest villains of the decade. That dishonor belongs to Russia. Now, it feels in bad taste to talk about how the Ukraine war will have an impact on the global market. There are a lot of bad things happening to innocent people, and it feels horrible to discuss how this will impact the price of blue jeans. But this is a video about global economics, and the show must go on. The Russian invasion of Ukraine will have a devastating impact on globalization. While China makes consumer goods that the world can survive without, both Russia and Ukraine export something much more vital: food. Combined, the two countries export about 36% of the world's wheat supply, and over half of the world's vegetable oils. With all food exports combined, Ukraine and Russia produce nearly 12% of the world's total calories. To make matters worse, Russia is the world's biggest fertilizer exporter, accounting for about 15% of the global fertilizer market. At the time of this video, Ukraine has been able to still export their grain, largely due to mediation brokered by Turkey. But most of the current grain exports are coming from a crop supply that was planted before the invasion. Unsurprisingly, Ukrainian farmers are having a hard time sowing next season's crop with an ongoing invasion. Even in parts of Ukraine that are far from the front line, many farmhands have left their jobs to support the defense effort. One way or another, the longer this war goes on, the more expensive food will become. But food prices aren't the only thing we have to worry about from this invasion. Do you live in Europe and like cheap utilities? I'm afraid I have some bad news. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you are already aware of the ongoing energy crisis in Europe. While Europe isn't actually engaged in real combat with Russia, they are certainly engaged in economic combat. As such, Putin shut off all westward flowing gas, and pipelines have been mysteriously sabotaged. Depending on the specific nation, Europe just lost about 10 to 30% of their total energy supply. This is going to cause more problems than just needing to wear extra clothes to stay warm. In the blue jean example, Germany plays a very critical role: the production of complex machinery and chemicals. The machines needed to process cotton into yarn, yarn into denim, and denim into pants can probably be traced to Germany one way or another. Germany's involvement in globalization extends well beyond blue jeans. Germany has positioned itself to be the third largest exporter in the world, only behind the US and China. While the United States provides services, and China provides labor, Germany provides something else that is just as crucial to make globalization work: sophisticated machinery and chemicals. Germany has positioned itself to be the leading supplier of complex machinery. Without German machinery, modern manufacturing simply wouldn't exist. Germany's integration into globalization allowed it to emerge as the largest economy in Europe. But there is one problem with the German economy: it needs affordable energy to operate. Energy which is becoming increasingly expensive, which will make the machines more expensive, which will make the manufacturing of goods more expensive, which will make goods more expensive for everyone. The interconnectivity of globalization means that when one major power faces an economic crisis, the whole world faces an economic crisis. The recent stresses on global supply lines may be enough to lead to the end of globalization. But I have good news. Sort of. Despite the gloomy headlines and events of this decade, globalization was destined to fail, all on its own. Globalization has done many amazing things. It has greatly reduced extreme poverty, provided more high-tech goods at cheap prices, and created the most rapid economic growth period in human history. But one of the byproducts of globalization is urbanization. Farmers can now use high-tech equipment for sowing, harvesting, and processing. The need for farmhands greatly decreased. Nearly everywhere on Earth, people left rural communities and moved to the cities for better job prospects. The dream of owning your own farm was replaced by the dream of becoming a yuppie. While this sounds inconsequential, it had a profound effect on birth rates. On the farm, kids are assets that provide free labor. In the city, kids are very expensive pets. As a result, birth rates plummeted across the industrialized world. We've talked about how globalization depends on access to safe seas, energy, raw materials, technology, and food. But I've saved the most important ingredient for globalization for last: people. For globalization to work, it needs a reliable supply of workers, consumers, and investors. And due to decreased birth rates, we're running out of all of those. When people are aged 18 to 65, they tend to be workers, consumers, taxpayers, and investors all at the same time. But that changes when they retire. Obviously, retired people don't work, but they also tend to reduce their consumption and stop investing. Much of their retirement funds are pulled out of the stock market and converted into bonds or cash. In most countries, they also receive some form of government pension. After decades of low fertility rates, there's going to be a smaller tax population to support these pensions. Assuming no changes are made to benefits, taxes must go up, which will reduce cash available for consumption and investment. Smaller investment pools means less technological innovation, and less consumption makes investing less profitable. Demographics and population pyramids will have a wide variance from country to country, but most nations that are fully industrialized are destined to reach a point where there are more retirees than there are workers. Most pensions, private or public, will struggle to achieve promised payouts. But that's not the only concern with population collapse. The Dutch government has made a helpful list of what their country will look like when population decline really takes off. Are you planning a career in education or residential development? That's probably a bad idea. Planning a career in retail? That's going to be harder to do with fewer customers who are going to be paying higher taxes to accommodate retirees. Theaters, cinemas, and concert halls are all going to have a difficult time selling tickets when there's fewer people with smaller disposable incomes. I love Dutch city design as much as anybody else, but that's going to be harder to maintain with a smaller tax pool. With widespread population decline, quality of life standards may have already peaked in 2019. In conjunction with inflation, we can expect a future with higher taxes or reduced public benefits, possibly both. That's not all we can expect to lose with population decline. Stanford economist Charles Jones recently authored a paper titled "The End of Economic Growth: Unintended Consequences of a Declining Population." In the paper, Jones proposed what new economic models will look like with a declining population. To greatly oversimplify, Jones predicts that with less people, there will be fewer technological advancements. So much so that quality of living standards will plateau. When most people reach for hope, when contemplating economic decline from depopulation, they look to Japan. Japan has been dealing with the challenges of population decline for about 5 decades. And their GDP per capita peaked in 2012. All things considered, that's not too bad, but their methodology won't be replicable in other countries. To remain economically viable during their demographic crisis, Japan relied on a new economic strategy called sourcing. Instead of manufacturing in Japan, multinational companies would rely on local labor forces where their products are sold. If a Toyota was sold in America, it was probably built in America. If a Toshiba was sold in Brazil, it was probably built in Brazil. This works fine and well, until the client countries start experiencing their own population decline-induced recession. As workforces and customer pools start to shrink around the world, desourcing will become a less viable solution, if possible at all. Additionally, Japan was already wealthy when they started to experience population decline. They had the needed capital to pay for all the new manufacturing hubs as part of their desourcing strategy. Other countries who got old before they got rich won't be able to do the same. If you're lucky enough to live in a rich country, your quality of life has probably already peaked and will plateau over the next few decades. If you live in a poor country, there's a strong chance that your quality of life will decline. But forward-thinking rich countries will beg you to immigrate there. Humanity's next chapter looks pretty grim. Probably not Bronze Age collapse grim, but the golden age of globalization is coming to an end. Maybe. At the end of Jones's paper, he concluded that the economy has a way of sorting itself out during major stresses. Who knows? Maybe decreased housing costs can free up cash to invest in automation that will save us from a worker shortage. Maybe healthier lifestyles will allow people to work beyond the age of 65. But what do you think? Has our quality of life peaked? Or can we expect continued wealth growth and technological advancement in the coming decades? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see more videos like this one, do let me know by liking and subscribing. If you want to help sponsor more videos like this in the future, check out my Patreon page.